They tried to silence me before my 14th birthday, so I exposed their secret ceremony, and then my cutting was scheduled for the second Saturday after my 13th birthday. That date was burned into my mind, more terrifying than anything I'd ever faced before. I had watched what happened to my sister just 1 year earlier, and there wasn't a single part of me that believed I'd survive what she went through. Our community lived outside a place called Elliston, tucked between the woods and the far edge of a dried-out railroad line. Outsiders called us conservative, but that word didn't even begin to describe what we lived under. Girls were raised to be silent, literally. When we turned 14, we were taken to a hut in the woods and had our vocal cords cut. Not completely, just enough to make our voices softer. More gentle, as they called it. The belief was that soft-spoken wives made for more obedient women. There was no anesthesia. The doctor was some old man who'd been doing it for decades, and he used the same rusted tools every single time. They were heated in fire, but never properly cleaned. Some of the older women claimed that pain was part of the purity. I always thought that was just something they told themselves so they could sleep at night. My sister, Jana, had been through it just after her 16th birthday because they'd pushed hers back after an illness. It was supposed to be a celebration of womanhood, so they threw her a dinner the night she came home from the hut. I remember her sitting there at the table, trying to thank them. But only this whisper of air came out, like a balloon deflating. Blood soaked through the white gauze around her neck and started dripping onto the edge of her plate. She tried to sip her soup, but every swallow looked like it might kill her. Her hands shook. Her eyes darted toward me across the table, and I could see it. The fear. The kind you don't recover from. Later that night, when everyone else had gone to bed, I tiptoed into her room. I sat next to her while she tried to write something down. I whispered, "Did it hurt?" And she just looked at me. Then she started to nod, and her lips parted like she wanted to scream, but nothing came out. Just this horrible wheezing sound. 3 weeks later, I woke up to her gasping for air. The noise pulled me out of sleep like an alarm going off. I ran into her room and found her collapsed on the floor, clawing at her throat, eyes wide, blood on her pillow. The stitches had torn open in the night. She was choking on her own blood. My parents didn't even call for help. They just threw her into the back seat and drove her to the same place where she'd been cut. I came too, though they didn't say a word to me. I sat in the car, gripping the seat, trying not to throw up from the smell of blood. Inside the hut, Jana couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. She wrote, "Can't breathe," over and over on a piece of cardboard while the doctor looked at her like she was some kind of puzzle he couldn't be bothered to solve. He restitched her throat without anything for the pain. Her whole body jerked every time the needle went in. After that, she couldn't sleep lying down. She was too scared of drowning again. She would doze off sitting up against the wall, legs curled under her, throat wrapped like a mummy. And then, the worst part came. 3 boys at school, older, mean, awful, cornered her in the sports supply shed. Everyone knew cut girls couldn't scream. That was the point. When she came out 20 minutes later, her shirt was torn, her hair was a mess, and her hands were shaking like leaves in a thunderstorm. She wrote everything down, names, details, all of it. My parents didn't believe her. They said she was confused, said maybe she wanted the attention. The school said there wasn't enough evidence to do anything. Her voice had been stolen, and now her truth was stolen too. 8 months later, she was gone. She didn't leave a long note, just a page in a notebook she used to carry around. Each word was printed carefully in pencil. "I feel buried alive in my own body." At the funeral, my mother gave a speech about how Jana had always been too sensitive. She said my sister should have embraced her role like the other women. That pain made us holy. That silence was our power. I stood in the back, watching all the cut women nod their heads while their husbands rested hands on their shoulders. It wasn't affection, it looked like control, like ownership, like they were holding down ghosts. No one mentioned that Jana had begged them not to do it. No one talked about the bruises or the shed. They just said God called her home. That was the moment something broke inside me. I counted the days until my appointment, watched them fall off the calendar like dead leaves. I wanted to run, to vanish into the woods like something feral. But I had no money, no connections outside Elliston, no one who would even believe what we did here was real. Then, a week before my date, I found my escape. Or maybe I created it. We were having a cookout at our house for some of my dad's friends. One of them had a son named Troy, 19, away at school most of the year, but home for the summer. He was drunk by sundown, laughing too loud, his shirt already stained with beer. I knew he'd noticed me over the last year. I had started to grow into myself, and in this town, That meant I was suddenly something to claim. I went up to him while everyone else was distracted and started talking to him the way I'd seen older girls do. I smiled too wide, touched his arm like it was instinct. Inside, I felt like I was crawling out of my skin. Later, we went to his place. We slept together. It was my first time, and nothing about it was like the movies. I felt numb, hollow, ashamed. But when I looked in the mirror the next morning, I told myself it was worth it. 2 days later, I showed my mother a pregnancy test. Troy had worn protection, but I'd stolen a used test from a girl at school who'd pulled the same trick the year before. I pressed it into my mother's hand, watched her face go from confusion to relief. There was an emergency family meeting that night. My aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them sat around our dining room table like it was a town hall. Everyone agreed that the ritual would be postponed. Cutting a pregnant girl was too dangerous, and Troy would make a fine husband. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, and pretended to be embarrassed. But inside, I felt like I had just jumped off a sinking ship and hit water. Phase 1 had worked. Now all I had to do was survive long enough to finish what Jana started. My stomach was a twisted knot of nerves each time I left the house pretending to go to a prenatal checkup. I had the lie rehearsed so well that even I sometimes believed it. But those appointments weren't with doctors. I was meeting girls, cut girls, uncut girls, ones who'd barely survived the ritual, and others still waiting for their turn. We gathered in hidden corners of old barns, dusty attics, basements with broken windows. I held my phone out while they whispered or signed their truths. Some couldn't speak above a breathy rasp. Others used notebooks, shaking fingers, scribbling what their voices could no longer carry. I recorded everything. Dozens of stories, each one a wound still open. I saved the files in a deep folder beneath layers of dummy homework and sermon recordings. I renamed them things like choir practice or scripture memorization. I thought I was being careful. I thought I had time. But like most mistakes, mine came down to one moment of arrogance. I left the house one evening after dinner. My mother was supposed to be at a neighbor's prayer circle. I thought I was safe, so I didn't take the usual back route. I didn't even check for her car. I just walked straight to the meeting place, as if the universe owed me a night of ease. But the universe doesn't work like that. I don't know how long she followed me. Maybe she had suspected something for days. Maybe a neighbor had seen me somewhere I shouldn't have been. Or maybe she simply didn't trust her own daughter. When I came home that night, I knew something was wrong before I even opened the door. The porch light was off. My father's truck was in the driveway, even though he always worked late. The second I stepped into the kitchen, he lunged from the shadows and pinned me down. My shoulder hit the tile with a crack. And before I could scream, my mother was there too. She pressed her knee into my abdomen, hard, then started stomping on my bladder. Over and over. I screamed, but it didn't matter. They weren't listening. I wet myself on the floor, shaking from pain and panic. That was what they wanted. She shoved a test strip at me, sneering. Let's see what you're really hiding. The test came back negative. Of course it did. My father's face twisted into something I didn't recognize. My mother didn't even look surprised. They sat me down and brought out my phone. Somehow, they'd guessed the passcode. They found the recordings. Everything I'd collected, all those testimonies, all those girls who had trusted me, gone in seconds. My father stood there, I scanning the screen, then calmly called Troy's parents. He said I had deceived their son, tricked him, ruined the family's honor. Then he turned to me and struck me across the face so hard my vision blurred. I barely remember the rest of that night. Just noise, shouting, the cold of the kitchen floor. They made me apologize to Troy. I don't even know what I said. He just stared at me, confused and humiliated, like he couldn't remember half of what had happened. When the shouting was over, my father called for another family meeting. This time there was no debate, no sympathy. They'd already made the decision. We're doing a triple cut, he said. Tomorrow morning. He said it like he was announcing the weather. Just something that needed to happen. He told me I'd never speak again, not even a whisper. Maybe that would teach me something. Then he let me fall to the floor like I was garbage he no longer cared to hold. They locked me in my room from the outside. I sat on the floor, ribs aching from where he'd grabbed me, breath coming in short panicked bursts. The boards on my window had been nailed shut. I was sealed inside, a package waiting for delivery. Around midnight, I heard something tapping at the glass. I jumped up, my heart pounding, thinking maybe, just maybe, someone had come for me. But it was just a branch in the wind. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, praying they hadn't taken it. It was there, but when I opened the folders, empty. Every voice erased. Months of work gone. Every girl's story wiped out like it had never mattered. Then I heard my mother outside the door, speaking on the phone. Her voice was quiet, but the walls were thin. She was talking to the doctor, confirming the procedure. I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. No solid food for 2 weeks. Heavy risk of bleeding. Full restraint required. I heard her say that sedation wasn't an option. She said I needed to be awake so the doctor could judge how deep to cut. I searched my room for anything sharp, anything I could use, but they had removed it all. Not even my nail file remained. The message was clear. There was no escape this time. At dawn, I heard voices downstairs. People arriving. Extended family. All there to make sure I didn't try to run again. When the door finally opened, my father stood there with 2 of my uncles behind him. They didn't say a word, just yanked me to my feet. My mother followed with the white dress in her hands. It was Janice, still stained despite all the washing. She slipped it over my head like it was just another chore to complete. Downstairs, more family waited. Some of the women wouldn't look at me. Others nodded like I was finally doing the right thing. My grandmother sat in her chair, scarred throat visible above her collar, eyes dead and distant. They zip-tied my wrists in front of me. The plastic cut into my skin as I tried to move. They treated me like cargo. Not a girl. Not a daughter. 3 cars waited outside. I was shoved into the middle one, flanked by uncles. My father drove ahead. More followed behind. No room for error. No space to run. We passed the school where I had recorded the stories. A few girls were outside, walking to class. One of them saw me in the white dress and froze, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. Then we turned off the road and into the woods. The hut appeared just like I remembered it from when Jana was brought here. The thatched roof sagging, smoke from the fire rising into the sky. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't work. My uncles dragged me through the dirt like a broken doll. Inside, the doctor waited. Old, cold-eyed. The same man who had ruined my sister's voice. The table was already prepped. Leather straps hung from it, worn and stained. 3 blades lay beside it, each designed to destroy a different part of what made me speak. They lifted me onto the table. I screamed. I kicked. They didn't care. Straps went around my arms, legs, waist. A final one pressed across my forehead, pinning me down. All I could move were my eyes. The doctor approached without a word. His fingers prodded my throat, feeling for the spot. The first blade glinted in the firelight. Then we heard it. Shouting. Car doors slamming. Dozens of voices outside. My father stormed to the door. Through the crack I saw them. Cars pulling up. Mothers, daughters. Girls I had interviewed. Catherine, the first girl who had trusted me, stood at the front holding something. My phone. But I had seen it empty. They'd deleted everything. How? Catherine must have saved it. Uploaded it. Backed it up before I ever lost it. She held the phone up and pressed play. And suddenly, my voice filled the room. Then the voices of the others. Girls describing their surgeries. Their complications. Their attacks. Their fear. The crowd grew. More mothers. Some fathers. All of them listening. Some crying. Some yelling. The doctor stepped back. My mother tried to block the door, but they pushed past her. Catherine's mom undid the straps while my mother screamed for someone to stop them. No one did. The straps fell away. I sat up slowly, throat untouched. The blade still sat and used beside me. And outside the hut, silence shattered into something louder than screaming, truth. My father didn't speak a single word as we drove home from the hut. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw so tight it looked like he might break it just from clenching. The silence between us was louder than any argument. I sat in the back seat, still wearing Jana's white dress, stained and wrinkled from the dirt. My skin stung where the straps had dug in, but none of that hurt as much as what came next. When we pulled into the driveway, the rest of the family was already there. My grandmother sat in her usual chair, flanked by aunts and cousins, all of them whispering in low, bitter tones. As soon as I stepped out of the car, the judgment poured over me like boiling water. They didn't shout. They didn't hit. They just stared. My father opened the front door and stood there waiting, like he was presenting me to a jury. One by one, the others filed into the living room. I wasn't asked to sit. I was ordered to. A chair in the center of the room had been placed just for me, angled so I couldn't avoid the weight of their eyes. My grandmother was the first to speak. She talked about legacy, about the burden of being a woman, about how pain was the only path to virtue. Her words were sharp and rehearsed, the kind of thing I knew she'd said to dozens of girls before me. I could see her scar as she talked, thick and faded but still visible. She wore it like a badge. My aunts followed with their own sermons. Obedience, discipline, respect for tradition. They accused me of shame, of betrayal, of corrupting other girls. My father didn't speak until the end. When he did, It wasn't a speech, it was a sentence. You have two options. You get cut tomorrow morning, or you leave this house forever. That was it. No emotion, no hesitation, just exile or silence. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of mercy, but they were stone. My mother sat off to the side, staring at her lap like she couldn't bear to look me in the eye. That hurt worse than the rest. I said the words slowly, clearly. I choose exile. There was a pause. Then my father nodded once like a judge confirming a punishment. He allowed me 1 hour to pack, supervised by two of my uncles. They followed me into my room and watched me like prison guards. No photos, no keepsakes, no heirlooms. Just clothes, a toothbrush, and the old sneakers I'd hidden under my bed. My mother came to the doorway as I was folding the last shirt. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her arms crossed like she didn't know if she wanted to hug me or slap me. Then, slowly, she walked over and adjusted my collar. Her hands trembled, but still she said nothing. And then she left. When I came down the stairs, the family had lined up like a funeral procession. Some turned their heads away as I passed. Others looked at me like I was a ghost already. My grandmother spat at the floor in front of me, and that was the last thing she ever gave me. At the door, my father handed me a plain envelope. Inside was a wad of cash, enough for a bus ticket and maybe 3 days in a motel. If anyone helps you, he said, they're no longer part of this family either. He opened the door, but didn't step aside. I had to walk around him. Waiting at the edge of our driveway were 5 cars. Inside them were girls, mothers, and families who had come back for me after the chaos at the hut. Catherine stood beside her mother, holding out a bag like she'd been waiting for this moment all her life. They didn't ask what had happened. They didn't question what I wanted. They simply took my bag, opened the car door, and made space for me. We drove for nearly an hour. I didn't speak. My voice felt locked behind a wall of exhaustion and disbelief. Catherine's mother didn't push. She just handed me a blanket and let me stare out the window. The house they took me to was small, barely held together, but it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in weeks, I slept without someone on the other side of the door. Word spread fast. Within 2 days, I was the talk of the entire region. Some families praised me in secret. Others said I'd cursed my bloodline. Girls began slipping notes under my door, telling me they wanted out too. That's when we started planning. Catherine and I formed a system, a map of safe houses, drivers, girls who knew how to vanish for a week or two. We gave code names to people who helped us. Some provided food. Others gave cash or burner phones. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. One girl, Maggie, ran the night before her appointment and slept in a shed behind a gas station for 2 days. When we found her, she had cuts on her arms from crawling through barbed wire. She said it still hurt less than being cut by the doctor. But the more girls we helped, the harder the pressure came down. My father started traveling to nearby towns, trying to revive the ritual where it had started dying. I heard through whispers that he was calling us decay, that he believed silence was the only way to keep women pure. We found out that the doctor hadn't vanished after the confrontation. He was hiding with a family loyal to the tradition. My father had paid him extra to stay in the region. He was still cutting girls, quietly, carefully, out of sight. That news nearly broke me. But I didn't stop. Then came the letter, delivered by a trembling neighbor girl who wouldn't even meet my eyes. My grandmother was dying. She wanted to see me. I thought it was a trap. I refused at first. But my mother reached out separately. She said my grandmother had been listening to the recordings. Said she had something I needed to see. We arranged it for 3 nights later, when my father would be out of town meeting with other leaders. The plan was risky. Catherine's mom would drive me and wait outside. If anything went wrong, I'd run. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch light blinked twice, our signal. I crept through the back door. My mother met me in the kitchen, her face drawn and pale. She led me upstairs to my grandmother's room. She looked so frail it was hard to believe she was the same woman who had defended the cutting for decades. Her hands were paper. Her voice was rough and broken. But her eyes were awake. She told me everything. How she'd been cut at 12. How she screamed so loud they broke her teeth trying to hold her down. How infection nearly killed her. How she had known all along it was wrong, but couldn't face the shame of admitting it. She pulled out a wooden box from under her bed. Inside were records, names of girls who had died, letters from families begging to delay the cutting, payment logs showing that this was never about virtue. It was about power. The final revelation came like a punch to the ribs. The doctor was her nephew, trained by her father. Our family had kept this tradition alive for nearly 4 generations. She gripped my hand and begged me to burn it all down. And I swore I would. I left that house with the box under my arm and fire in my chest. That night, we copied every document, backed up every file. Catherine and I knew what we had wasn't just evidence. It was dynamite. The next time my father tried to speak in public, we'd light the fuse. The day of the town hall meeting, the sun came up red like something had already burned. I sat in Catherine's kitchen while her mother ironed my shirt, trying to make it look like I hadn't lived out of a backpack for months. She didn't speak much, just offered me tea with honey, as if preparing for war was no different than making breakfast. That morning, word had gone out that my father would be speaking at the regional gathering of elders. Every family that still followed the ritual was expected to attend. They framed it as a conversation, but we all knew it was a last push to hold the tradition together. He would stand at the front of that hall and spin lies until they sounded like truth. But this time, we would be ready. Catherine's friends had printed dozens of documents, payment records, written testimonies, letters from the families who'd begged to stop the cutting. They had created anonymous phone accounts and pre-scheduled messages that would go out mid-meeting. The recordings were backed up across 5 servers, translated, and edited into clips short enough to be shared instantly. We weren't just fighting tradition anymore. We were fighting decades of silence, shame, and fear. But now we had a voice they couldn't erase. From the street, the town hall looked like any other building, gray and unremarkable. But inside, tension bloomed like mold on every wall. Rows of benches were filled with mothers and daughters, uncles and cousins. You could see the divide in the way people sat. Families in support of the ritual grouped tightly in front, whispering like they already knew what was coming. In the back, I spotted 3 girls we had helped escape. Their hair had grown out. Their shoulders weren't hunched anymore. I hadn't even realized until then how much taller some of them stood, without fear pressing down. My father arrived last. He walked in like he owned the air, flanked by men who'd sat in power for years. His suit was pressed. His scar was hidden under a high collar. His eyes found mine across the room, and for a moment, neither of us looked away. Then he stepped onto the stage, tapped the microphone, and began his speech. He said the resistance was a disease, that foreign ideas had poisoned our daughters. He painted me as a girl who had lost her way, misled by city people and their ungodly influence. He spoke of our grandmother as a woman of strength, completely erasing her final confession. Then he said something that nearly made me laugh. He said the ritual had never harmed anyone, that it had been a gift. That's when the phone started ringing. All across the hall, parents and girls pulled out devices as messages flooded in. Catherine's team had timed it perfectly. Short clips played on screen after screen, snippets of girls sobbing through pain, whispering about infections, describing the sound of their own voices dying. My grandmother's confession came last. Her voice was cracked, but her words were sharp. She named names. She admitted the tradition wasn't ancient, just 4 generations old, imported from another region like a virus carried by ambition. She said my father was the one who had made sure it survived. Gasps echoed through the room. Some people stood up. Others just froze, stuck between what they believed and what they were hearing. My father tried to speak over it, shouting about manipulation and lies. But it was too late. The recordings kept playing. Then a man near the front stood and shouted back. He named his niece, a girl who had bled for days after her cutting and never recovered. Another woman shouted about her sister, who hadn't spoken since the age of 13. The room erupted. Arguments spilled into every corner. The doctor tried to leave, but 2 men blocked his path. They wanted answers. Catherine stood beside me, shaking but steady. I squeezed her hand. We had done it. By the end of the meeting, it was chaos. But it was our chaos. The kind that cracks old walls and lets new light in. Outside, the crowd didn't disperse. Parents cried in the parking lot. Daughters hugged each other like survivors of the same storm. Some families tore up their cutting appointment cards right there on the steps. Back at the safe house, we waited for what would come next. We didn't celebrate. Not yet. We knew how deep our enemy's roots went. My father vanished from public life after that day. Some said he was regrouping. Others claimed he was in hiding. But I knew better. He wasn't the kind of man who gave up. 2 weeks later, families that had spoken against the cutting had their businesses vandalized. Supporters received anonymous threats. A few girls even disappeared from school again, returned days later with bandages on their necks and haunted eyes. We had won a battle, but not the war. That's when we made the decision to go public outside the community. Catherine and I uploaded everything online under a fake name. We shared the documents, the audio files, the testimonies. We created a network that stretched beyond our region, connecting with girls in other towns, other states. places we'd never even heard of. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of messages came in. Girls from other communities were facing the same thing. Some had worse versions. Others had rituals that were different in form but identical in cruelty. We were no longer alone. The network became a lifeline. We built maps of escape routes, organized safe spaces, connected girls with counselors, doctors, and lawyers willing to help. It became something larger than us, a machine made of survivors. That's when my mother reappeared. She showed up unannounced at the safe house. I nearly didn't open the door, but something in her face stopped me. She looked older, more tired. She held out another box. This one wasn't from my grandmother. It was from her. Inside were more records, letters she had found in the attic, receipts showing how much money had been made off every girl cut, old appointment logs marked with red XS. Some of them dated just days before the girls had died. She stood in the doorway and said something I'll never forget. Do something better with our name than we ever did. Then she left. We burned the cutting hut 2 weeks later. Hundreds of us gathered. Mothers, daughters, sisters, a few fathers too. We didn't shout. We didn't cheer. We stood silent as the flames rose, as if giving the silence back to the fire. When the roof collapsed, someone started humming. Then another joined. Soon we were all singing, not a song from tradition, but something new, something borrowed from every voice that had survived. That night, I slept without fear for the first time in years. But I knew it wasn't over. My father was still out there, and the blade hadn't finished moving yet. 3 months after we burned the hut, I started attending night classes at a small clinic in a town 2 hours east. It wasn't official schooling, just a volunteer nurse named Yvonne who met with girls like me twice a week, teaching us the parts of our bodies we were never allowed to know. We studied anatomy in a cramped back room that smelled like bleach and hope, surrounded by diagrams and worn-out textbooks. I traced illustrations of the larynx with my fingers and listened as Yvonne taught us what each muscle and nerve was called. With every lesson, I became more aware of what they had tried to take from me. The anger didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. I looked at those medical charts and remembered the blades. I remembered the straps. I remembered the moment the doctor touched my throat and marked me like property, while I memorized each structure of the voice box. I imagined carving a future where girls would never need to flinch when they swallowed. Back home, Catherine kept the safe house running with more grace than I could ever manage. She had a way of sitting beside frightened girls in silence that made them feel safe without needing explanation. We stopped thinking of what we were doing as survival. We had become something else entirely. The movement had grown louder than we'd ever expected. Word traveled farther than we planned, crossing into towns we couldn't even locate on maps. One morning, we received an email from a girl in Arizona who said she'd recognized the ritual in a local church. Another from Louisiana told us she'd found one of our files taped to the back of a public restroom door. What we thought was a local fire had become something that crossed borders and buried itself in systems far older than we'd imagined. And then one day, a girl named Marnie showed up at the safe house with bandages around her neck and bruises in the shape of fingers. She told us she had escaped from a ceremony in a town called Florence Ridge. None of us had ever heard of it. When we pulled up our network maps, it wasn't on any of the routes. That alone made us uneasy. Marnie said the doctor there was new. He didn't wear a mask like the others. He limped slightly and wore a silver ring on his pinky. She hadn't seen his face clearly, but she remembered his hands, strong, familiar, and calm in a way that made her stomach churn. The second she said he limped and wore that ring, I knew. I didn't need proof. I didn't need to see him. It was my father. Some part of me had always known he wouldn't stop. My father was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. If he couldn't spread the tradition through one town, he'd carry it like a plague into another. He'd change his name, shift the doctrine, adjust the language just enough to make it seem like something new. But the blades would stay the same. The pain would repeat. I wanted to go straight to the authorities, slam down the box of files, show them Marnie's bruises and demand justice. But Catherine stopped me before I could act. She reminded me that people like my father were protected, and the law had looked away too many times already. Instead, we prepared to go ourselves. We didn't announce anything. We told no one. If we didn't return in 3 days, our team would release every document to every newspaper and outlet we knew. It was enough to make me feel steadied again. I packed light, just a small bag, my grandmother's file box, and a burner phone. Yvonne came with us, quiet and serious, the way women are when they've seen too much and still choose to help. When we arrived in Florence Ridge, the town felt like it had been dipped in silence. Windows were closed. Lawns were trimmed too neatly. People watched us from behind curtains. No one smiled. We found the shed on the edge of the woods. Ivy covered the sides, but the new lock on the door gleamed like it had been installed just that week. Inside, the smell nearly made me gag. Bleach, blood, iron. The walls were stained with old moisture. A small table held surgical instruments that hadn't been cleaned properly. In the corner, we found a girl, barely 11, maybe 12, bound to a chair with a cloth over her mouth. Her eyes were red from crying. She looked drugged, like her body hadn't caught up to the panic in her mind. We untied her, helped her drink water, and she whispered the word we'd all needed to hear. Help. That's when the door creaked open. He stepped in like he'd just come home. His eyes landed on me, and I saw no surprise. No guilt. Just that cold steadiness I had known since I was small. He shut the door behind him, slowly, and said one thing. I should have finished you when I had the chance. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. Yvonne stepped in front of me instinctively, while Catherine pulled the girl behind her toward the wall. He started toward us, calm and deliberate, like a man who believed we wouldn't dare stop him. But he didn't see what was coming behind him. 4 older girls burst in through the rear entrance. I didn't know their names, but I knew their rage. They weren't there to be rescued. They had come to fight. One swung a plank of wood straight into his back. Another grabbed a tray of blades and threw it to the floor. He staggered, shouted something unintelligible. Then the fire started. We never learned how exactly. Maybe a kicked lantern. Maybe a knocked-over oil can. But the heat roared up the walls in seconds. We grabbed the youngest girl and ran. The air choked our lungs. Smoke poured from the corners. As we stumbled into daylight, the shed behind us collapsed in flames. We waited for hours, but no body was recovered. Nothing identifiable. Just burnt tools, a half-melted ring, and, buried near the door, an old ceremonial blade, blackened but intact. Catherine said he must have escaped. Yvonne hoped it was enough to end him. I didn't say anything. I knew my father too well. Even if he was dead, his doctrine had followers. His silence had worshippers. Men like him don't vanish. They wait in places that fear doesn't reach until it's too late. A week passed. Then, one morning, I found a box on the steps of the clinic. No return label. No note. Inside was my grandmother's ritual book, the one I had left with my mother months ago. But this time, something was different. Carved into the leather, deep and fresh, was my name. No explanation. No signature. Just the act itself. My name burned into the cover like a passing of a torch or a dare to pick it up. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I didn't tell Catherine right away. I just ran my hand over the letters, closed the book, and carried it under my arm as I walked inside the clinic. That afternoon, I stood in front of the classroom with a diagram behind me and a pointer in my hand. I showed them the parts of the throat, the cords, the muscles, the nerves that carry sound. I taught them the anatomy that had once been used to justify our pain. I told them where the blade used to aim. And then I showed them how we fight back now. How we use the same knowledge they tried to keep from us to save each other. To break the cycle. To make the pain stop here. Not with silence. Not with suffering. But with truth that cuts deeper than any knife ever could.